And now I would like to give the floor to a person who I always refer to when I have lectures with my students. I usually refer them to the manuals written by Mr. Tymchenko, Olexander Tymchenko, the founding father of the psychology of extreme situations, and he is a doctor of psychology. Our great mentors were Mr. Medvedev, then Alexander Tymchenko here. Whatever he does is always great and talented. People from the State Emergency Service, do you agree? Yes, we do. Esteemed Larissa, dear friends, colleagues, co-organizers of this forum. Over the last 5,500 years alone, more than 14,500 large and small wars took place on our planet. More than 4 billion people died from hunger and epidemics in the flames of those conflicts. This is the price humanity has paid for using alternative means to pursue politics. We first responders are too well aware that every emergency of a military nature is a drama, bizarre in its realism and tragedy, a drama that invariably affects the soul of each homeland defender that leaves indelible scars therein. War wounds and injuries, especially mental traumas, do not heal quickly. That's why in our country, suffering from the Russian aggression, the most difficult trial for a combatant will be returning from this war after our victory over the enemy. Today, however, psychologists and therapists alike have only got a vague idea of the true scale of the adverse effects of the military emergency. What we can argue with certainty is that none of the natural or man-made disasters known to humankind is comparable to war, be it a local conflict or an all-out war, in its extreme intensity and its psychological consequences. Sorry, can't scroll it. In this sense, we can say that along with the external war, each of our defenders who has also lived through an internal war, a war between fear and duty. And this internal war is often more protracted and dramatic than the external one. A person who fears for their life is constantly tensed and stressed, trying to foresee the time and the nature of their death. The effect of the existential factors of the Russo-Ukrainian war will be prolonged. Where a regular citizen in the natural disaster zone or even in the area close to the battlefield can find an opportunity for respite, the military, police, special operation forces or security service personnel, border guards or rescuers who perform professional tasks in the combat zone will be in permanent danger, regardless of whether they operate on the contact line, in its vicinity, or in the enemy's rear. As far back as in 1908, a military doctor, Gerasim Shumkov, noted that human fighters behave in a specific manner in the times of war and in combat. On the one hand, they operate under chronic danger, that is, constant danger of losing their health or life, and on the other, under conditions of impunity for destroying other people's lives, which is absolutely necessary for their own self-preservation and thus encouraged in the name of their homeland and fellow citizens. Outside the combat zone, though, a set of adaptive responses acquired in this terrible war unleashed by the Russian Federation becomes maladaptive. We are convinced that the return of a combatant whose psychic has been affected adversely by the war, but who is ill prepared for peaceful life, can lead to re traumatization. Mental trauma caused by the veteran's unprepared encounter with a peaceful society that seems incomprehensive and alien to them can be more severe than a combat mental trauma. Given this, the state will face three main problems or issues. Number one, how to bring mentally healthy citizens back into the society and at the same time protect the society from possible aggression and uncontrolled spontaneous belligerence. Problem number two, how to protect a war veteran, a psychologically vulnerable person, from the traumatic impact of a peaceful life that is cruel to them. And problem number three, how to end the war, not only on legal terms. I'm sure today it is quite legitimate to apply the following psychological criterion regarding the end of the Russo-Ukrainian war. The war with Russia for freedom and independence of our country will not end until the last Ukrainian soldier mentally returns from it. However, the defenders' physical return to a peaceful environment will not always mean they are intellectually, emotionally, sensually back and belong to the environment of everyday connections and relationships. And frankly speaking, we Ukrainian psychologists have yet to address this issue properly. The issue arose back in 2014 when the anti-terrorist operation and de facto low-intensity war began. Sometimes foreign experts tag such conflicts as wars of three quarters, when fierce battles are raging in one quarter of the city while the other quarters are normal, peaceful, and life there continues. A combatant in the war of three quarters may cross the line between war and peace multiple times within one day, which leads to a clash of identities and a constant restructuring of their psyche. It could be expected that our defenders' quick but unprepared return to peaceful life will give rise to a whole series of psychological problems. May I remind you that after the First and Second World War, it took the combatants many weeks and months to return to their homeland. On their way back, they had an opportunity to share their memories with one another, thus acting as therapists, consultants, as compassionate listeners for their comrades. These sincere conversations triggered psychological mechanisms of a reaction, cognitive semantic processing of their traumatic experience in the emotionally supportive environment. And this experience was naturally integrated into their personal history and current existence. The psychologically unprocessed return of the Russo-Ukrainian war veterans could be very dangerous. A veteran who finds themselves in a peaceful society will be like a person with no skin, without the famous Freudian protective layer of the consciousness, and therefore any touch to their personality will cause pain and bleeding.
Veterans will return home with a huge baggage of psychological experiences. They've experienced a change in their behavior, a different attitude to the processes that are now taking place in the state. This will make significant changes in their outlook, habits of a person, which can manifest themselves in increased aggressiveness, inability to adapt to a peaceful life, and so on. Preparing to speak at our forum, I remember how 7 years later I first encountered the project of Lalata Snow, which is called We Are Not Dead. It was a series of portraits of British servicemen before, during, and after their participation in Afghan war. For 8 months, while this project lasted, the author managed to convey to the public both physical and mental changes that take place with soldiers in the war. I I found these photos. Once again, you can take a look at these photographs now, and these faces, they speak for themselves. I will not show the faces of our defenders today. I do not want to repeat the project of Lalaje Snow. I will show you only the face of our supreme commander. I think that not every one of you thought about how much human suffering and human pain passed through the soul of our president. Dear colleagues, in order to avoid senseless and tragic mistakes in the conditions of living together with veterans, we all need to learn the lessons of not only current Russian-Ukrainian war, but also from the past hybrid war, which started in 2014, other wars and local armed conflicts in which our parents, grandparents, and great parents had to take part. Learning objective lessons from such an extremely objective event as a war or a local armed conflict is a very subjective matter, and most importantly, it is extremely ungrateful. But I will try to formulate the main ones today. After all, each lesson that we learn from an emergency of a military nature shapes the price that Ukraine will have to pay for the altar of its victory. The first lesson is that our professional community must be potentially ready for war, hybrid, anti-terrorist, local, large-scale, or any other kind of war. To be prepared for war includes being ready professionally. In other words, each therapist should have in their system of professional competence such knowledge, skills, and abilities that will allow them, if necessary, to become an emergency crisis or military psychologist. Also, it is very important to have evidence-based technologies for solving problems of psychological support of combat operations. And last but not least, to have an organizational structure capable of consolidating psychologists of our state in the shortest possible time, mobilizing their efforts to solve defense problems. The second lesson is to recognize the enduring value and relevance of the experience of using psychology in the practices of ensuring the country's defense capability. For instance, during the years of independence of our country, 230 PhD theses were presented in the specialty 1909 Psychology of Activity in Special Conditions, 12 of them for the degree of Doctor of Psychological Sciences. Further analysis of 197 research papers were devoted to the professional contingents of the security and defense sector of Ukraine, and it made it possible to build this particular field of research, which we, much to our expectations, will help to use emergency and crisis psychology in the practice of ensuring the country's defense capability, and for future scientists to understand in what way we need to understand psychological problems and how they should be given priority when planning their own research activities. The third lesson is that even in conditions of limited time, it is important to implement innovations only after careful verification. Dozens of experiments were conducted by psychologists of the security and defense sector of Ukraine during the anti-terrorist operation and the joint forces operation in the east of our country. Prior to offering professional contingents recommendations on preventing fatigue, improving the effectiveness of surveillance and military camouflaging, training specialists of sniper groups, reducing combat mental trauma, reintegration, providing support and to release servicemen, etc. It is a pity that very many of these recommendations have not been embodied in the guidelines of most ministries and departments of the security and defense sector, and therefore they're not being used today in the course of military operations of our troops against the Russian Federation. Unfortunately, we have almost forgotten the experience of psychologists during the Second World War. I would like to provide one example. This is the example from the history of the Kharkiv School of extreme psychology. In early July 1941, like many other scientists, Alexei Mykolaievich Leontiev, who was in Kharkiv, then joined the ranks of the People's Militia. However, in September, the General Staff recalls him to perform a special defensive task. It was near Sverdlovsk in Kisigat and Kaurovsk. There were two experimental hospitals set up. The first one is headed by Alexander Romanovich Luria, a psychologist, and there was another experimental hospital headed by Alexei Mykolaievich Leontiev. Alexander Volodymyr Zaporozhets, Petro Yakovlevich Halperin, Susanna Yakovleva Rubinstein, and many other psychologists and psychophysiologists worked in these hospitals. These were rehabilitation hospitals, which helped to recover motor functions of the injured. On this material, we can only assess the importance of practical significance of the theory of activity, of physiological theory of Bernstein, who a few years later, at the end of the 40s, was completely excluded from the academia and does not know what would have happened to him if Alexei Nikolaevich Leontiev had not taken him to himself as an employee of the Department of Psychology. The practical result of the work of experimental hospitals was that the time of return of the wounded to combat units was reduced several times due to the use of techniques which were devised on the basis of the activity approach and Bernstein's theory. This lesson is extremely important today when there is a reform of mental health care, support and rehabilitation of professional contingents of the security and defense sector of Ukraine taking place, and when, unfortunately, there are still people who offer experimental and verified recommendation to the military and to state leadership. The first lesson: